Okay, I want to talk a little bit about somatic experiencing therapy and how I got into it, a little bit about how it works, how I've experienced it with clients, how it can be helpful, and so on. Just a basic introduction. There's a lot to somatic experiencing therapy. So this is who I am, retired pastor. I don't know if I'm really a pastoral counselor. I think I'm a pastor that doesn't know what to do with that word. I consider myself a somatic experiencing therapist. There's Paul Krauss with all his degrees. Okay, so we just want to give a little information about 3 different types of therapy that you may want to get into. And I want to say a word about how I got into somatic experiencing therapy because it was really helpful to me personally as a therapist and helped me not to get traumatized by my clients. So understanding what somatic experiencing therapy is, how it's utilized, where to seek advanced training, and so on, which is pretty easy. You just Google it. Understanding what EMDR therapy is, how it is utilized, and how and where to seek advanced training in these techniques. And understand what TF-CBT is, and I don't know what it is, so I'm going to learn something. How it is utilized, and how and where to seek advanced training in these techniques. Trauma shows up, as we've talked about, in lots of symptoms, and we talk about clients who are syndromal. Those are the people who have the worst trauma, the most chronic symptomology in trauma, fibromyalgia, all kinds of different things, but here's a list of some of the things which you might see in clients who have been traumatized. Quote from Stephen Porges. Stephen Porges is a scientist from the University of Chicago who's done a lot of work on what's actually happening in the healing and the trauma in the body and possibilities for healing. There hasn't really been enough science on healing processes. We know more about pathology than we do about how the body heals. Trauma compromises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. Stephen Porges. Okay, so just the basics. When we're confronted with life-threatening situations, we become confused, overwhelmed, and override our instinctive impulses. So this is kind of what I want to focus on beginning with the beginning point, is the overriding of the instinctive impulses. Because when they've done comparative studies with animals, they see how animals respond instinctively in the wild and how they release trauma and the trapped energy in the wild, and how we as human beings have a much more difficult time doing that because we're so smart. We pull away, we override from our instinctual response. Animals have a way of naturally shaking off the trapped energy which comes as a result of a traumatized event. So they've observed that animals in the wild, like impalas that are brought down by a lion or something like that, if the impala goes into a freeze response and plays dead, then if they escape and they get up and they run away, then they begin to shake off the trauma. They actually literally shake a little bit, and they do something called prompting. So they've observed that. So the impala will do a kind of celebrating, he'll do a little kind of dance, like, woohoo, I got away. And there's like this little shaking thing that's going on. Peter Levine also experienced that himself when he was in a car accident that he writes about. Peter Levine is one of those that has established somatic experiencing therapy. But he says, traumatic symptoms are not caused by the triggering event itself. They stem from the frozen residue of energy that has not been resolved and discharged. This residue remains trapped in the nervous system where it can cause havoc in our bodies and spirits. So that's about the trapped energy, that's the way he describes it. But in this car accident he had, it was pretty interesting. He was lying on the cement, hit by a car, and he was lying there. He was not in a car, he was walking across the street, and he started to shake and tremble. He had these like little tremors in his body, and someone came up, an EMT person or something, told him to stop shaking. That wasn't good. But he knew that that was actually a way to release some of this trauma, so he continued to do that until someone else came along and offered him the social support that he needed. So he did all right. It wasn't as bad as it might have been. Okay, so somatic experiencing therapy helps people with PTSD move in and through the freezing state. It helps them to move away from some of the defensive accommodations. I can explain a little bit about that come into play in the nervous system and the limbic system as coping attempts to ward off the inner sense of the continuing threat. So in other words, we have defensive responses in the body that become part of the problem in themselves. We have our coping mechanisms become ways in which we become stuck. The defensive accommodations, they can become behaviors or patterns in the body, or I mean a simple thing like having tension in your neck, or shrugging your shoulders, or tightening in the belly, or tightening in the chest, or feeling absent in the legs, or I mean there's a million different kinds of ways in which we try to accommodate for that stress that's built up in the body. So in the body-based work, the foundation for the therapy is in regulation. Adam talked a lot about regulating, that was really helpful, and I found that helpful in terms of the mindfulness, regulating through mindfulness. The regulating in SE is more about working with the body and helping the person with the felt sense. And those that do touch therapy, touch somatic experiencing therapy, use touch to help the nervous system regulate through the kidney adrenals, or by helping the person track with the felt sense inside, what we often call interoception. So I was going to say that one of the reasons why I got into this, I don't think I said this, was that about 10 years ago I had a heart attack and I went to the doctor and the cardiologist, and he said, "You'll be fine if you listen to your body." And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." He said, "Well, you just need to listen to your body." So that kind of started this process for me, learning to listen to my body, because I had no idea what that was. So I think as a therapist, if you're able to check in with yourself, just at the beginning place, whether you get interested in this kind of therapy or not, but having that internal sense of your own, what's happening inside, your own heartbeat, your own nervous system, you can make sure that you don't get traumatized. I had a couple clients before I learned this kind of therapy, all their trauma into the sessions, and I really think that I picked up a lot of trauma from them. You know, they kept telling their stories over and over again, and I wasn't really able to get them contact. You all right, Paul?
Yeah. We I think we've got somebody on the. Unless you're rubbing against the thing, I don't know. Let me just try.
No.
Let me try something. Keep talking. See if this works.
Okay, so in SE therapy, we use the metaphor of the window of tolerance. I think someone mentioned that earlier. The window of tolerance is that place where the sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of the nervous system are in a nice rhythm. And the sympathetic part of the nervous system, which was the activation cycle, is not going off the charts, but the person is in this relatively awake and calm kind of state. And they're able to return to that, place of normalcy in the nervous system. If they're not, then they just keep peaking up. The sympathetic part, the activating part of the nervous system keeps sending them up, and then they might crash. So it's like having an accelerator and brake on at the same time inside. So it feels like a kind of rattling, you know, or people describe it in different ways. Some people talk about anxiety. They experience it as anxiety. But when the person's regulated, they experience more lightness, resiliency, and find that things are changing for them. So what's the way forward? SE therapists make use of the felt sense. That's something that you really have to experience yourself. It's kind of hard to explain. Peter Levine talks about it as the instinctual voice, but it's really paying attention to the senses. Like what are you experiencing inside in terms of the senses? What is the felt sense that's also tied to the emotions? It's something that you practice. It was not something that I really knew how to do. I was really a very heady person until I got into this. So the more you practice being in touch with your interoception, your internal awareness of sensate awareness, the better you're able to do it, and also align with the client's ability to do it. So while Peter Levine says, while trauma is being frozen or stuck, pendulation is the innate or organismic organ rhythm of contraction and expansion. In other words, about getting unstuck, knowing from the inside that no matter how horrible one is feeling, those feelings can and will change. The therapist gives them a little taste of pleasant internal experience. So that's an important thing in this therapy, is to help the client feel some really positive or pleasant sensation experiences and be able to take in their own goodness and have a sense of the possibility of movement, even in a little bit. So like if a person feels a lot of pain and they're able to move towards a feeling that's different, any difference, any movement can be really significant for a client. And then they get a little more hope, and then there's more movement, and it continues to move. So it's really cool to see when it happens. Sometimes developmental trauma, like basic SE therapy often deals with accidents or the trauma that's experienced, specific traumas, car accidents or sexual trauma, rape, different specific traumatic experiences. The touch somatic experiencing therapy is often more about developmental trauma. So the whole experience of attachment that was talked about earlier, on helping the person experience the womb-like experience of therapy, that the therapy is a very comfortable place that you feel at home. All of that becomes really extremely important. And pendulation is kind of part of the terminology. It's this movement in the felt sense from a constricted place to a strong place. So it sounds complicated, but it's really pretty simple. So if you imagine in your body or in yourself, you had one part of you that you knew was really constricted or in pain. Like you knew that, for example, your shoulders were really stressed and you were carrying a lot in your shoulders and you could just feel that weight and you were maybe scrunching your shoulders up. That might be a place of constriction. And then maybe in your belly you would feel very centered and relaxed or something like that. Then in the therapy you would pendulate back and forth slowly between these two places until something moves. And often there's a lot that comes up with that. But we want to move people out of that freeze state. I think people who have developmental trauma are mostly in a freeze, so they have a lot of collapse, and there's usually depression that goes along with that collapse. So I had a client who had a distinct sense, and he would talk about this. He talked a lot about images, and he said that not only was he very weak as a child, but that he saw himself as concave. And during the SE therapy, he got this confidence in a physical core, and he would talk about this new strength that he could come back to, that he had a physical core. So this was just sort of a change in his physical awareness. I mean, it wasn't like he was bodybuilding or anything. He didn't go from being, a really skinny guy during therapy to a really muscular guy. It wasn't that. It was some awareness that was changing. So this is just a quote from Robert Scare. Robert Scare is a really interesting guy. If you read this book, The Trauma Spectrum, he was in an accident. Well, he was playing with another kid when he was about 4 years old, and this other kid took a hanger, and they were playing with the hangers like swords, and somehow this hanger went in Robert Scare's eye, and then he had like 3 surgeries following that, and he was only 4 years old. But part of the problem was the way his mother reacted and the way the doctors reacted and all the things that happened around the surgery. So he had a lot of early trauma. But he wrote this interesting book, Trauma Spectrum. He says, children are too slow to flee and too small to fight. In addition, if the trauma is perpetrated by a caregiver or family member, the source of safety is also the threat, and there is literally no place for the child to go and find safety. So that's kind of the bummer of it. Relational trauma often involves a lack of fundamental completion. So in a lot of SE work, there's talk about completion, that no matter what the trauma is, the traumatic event, something didn't get completed. And so that's what, like if there's paralysis or something like that, there's something that didn't get to happen, and that's why this freeze response is coming in. And so the same thing is with relational trauma, of people growing up, developmental trauma. Something didn't get completed in the family of origin. Something didn't get completed with the parents. So I have clients that have a really difficult time getting angry. And when a client starts to enact the anger, that is really a good sign, because they're coming more into a fight response. From an SE perspective, they're coming out of freeze. So, we want, if a client's in this freeze collapse state, we really want to see them being able to enact what they didn't get to enact as a child. Whatever they didn't get to do. If they weren't able to be sad, they get to be sad. If they weren't able to be angry, they get to be angry. Whatever it is, so that they can have this sense of agency, movement, success, victory, whatever it is that they need to have. So here's some little info about SE, Somatic Experiencing Traumatic Institute. If some of you are into yoga or body work or things like that, you can, often skip the basic training and just go into the touch work, which is really amazing. Stephen Terrell in Austin, Texas, Austin Attachment. His last name is Terrell, Stephen Terrell. He's an amazing trainer. His demos are scary good. They're scary good. I mean, he's kind of savant. So, thanks. I'm done.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Thank you. I'm going to continue the presentation in person to talk about EMDR and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is Paul Krauss back here again. I'm going to move into the presentation of talking about EMDR and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And here we go. Thanks so much, John. There's not many somatic experiencing therapists in this state, actually, is what I found out recently. I'm not sure how many of them there are, but I really appreciate John. He does great work. Right now, due to COVID, doing a lot of online somatic experiencing therapy, which is a new thing for sure. And I really appreciate that. So anyway, I'm Paul Krauss. I'm back to presenting for the last 18 to 20 minutes here. And I'm a EMDR International Association certified therapist, and I've been through EMDR level 1, level 2, and I can't remember how many hours of advanced training post that, probably like 45 to 60. to get certified. I'm now working on becoming I am a consultant in training, but my trainer, I have to get a new consultant to kind of train me so I can start doing more groups here in Michigan and online. So EMDR therapy stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Therapy. So Francine Shapiro is the one who came up with it. Dr. Francine Shapiro, she actually said she would have called it reprocessing therapy if she could have started all over. Because you don't necessarily need eye movement. That's the weird part that people don't understand. And most people, when they first hear of this therapy, they think it's the most bizarre thing that they've ever heard of. And I also was one of those people. When I first heard of it, I said, this sounds really weird, but my agency that I was working at in Phoenix said, we'll pay for you to go to it if you want. I said, sounds good. You're going to pay for me to go to this, and I get to sit in a room for 2 days and not, work in this really... I was working at a state agency that was quite dismal. We had mold and bed bugs and all sorts of fun stuff. So I was like all about that. So I went and learned it, and I learned level 1, and I was amazed and astounded at the personal results because we got to practice on each other. And I was like, I've never had any sort of therapy work on me like this. And it was instant results and instant insight. And it wasn't from anyone telling me anything or reflecting. It was just from doing these exercises. So it was very bizarre, but anyway, so it's an integrative psychotherapy. So now Randy's right. The relationship is everything. Because I've talked to some clients who have been to EMDR therapists before, and they had not a good relationship. And the therapist just said, okay, let's do the EMDR. Let's do it. Come on, more eye movement, more reprocessing. Well, we don't need to talk about that. We'll just, the processing will fix it. And so the relationship is still number one, because just because somatic experiencing and EMDR therapy and trauma-focused CBT have these stages and exercises and mind-body components doesn't mean that you can just do them like a robot to somebody. You've got to have the relationship, and you've got to understand the person's story even more integrally to be able to do these, and they have to trust you, because in EMDR therapy, you're working with eye movement or bilateral stimulation using some tools that we have. People have got to be able to trust you to do this weird stuff, okay? Somatic experiencing therapy even goes further, where there's even a waiver for physical touch near the kidneys in the back. That's even more intimate and requires a whole separate waiver for client contact. So it's got tons of research. The best thing about EMDR is the research. Well, not the best thing. The best thing about presenting on it is it's been studied so many times that it is very effective. And the reason I think it's effective is because it's taking all of the effective parts of talk therapy. It's taking elements, and EMDR International Institute, they're not really cool with me saying this, but I think it's taking the best parts of talk therapy, which we know is very effective if you have a good relationship. It's taking the best parts of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's finding out what those negative stories are and what the positive story result would be. It's taking the best parts of mindfulness and hypnosis and combining them with some sort of new thing that's coming, because when we do the bilateral stimulation, we're finding that it's stimulating the same part of the brain that is stimulated when you have REM eye movement, rapid eye movement, and sleep going back and forth. And so even if you're just doing bilateral stimulation, like I have these buzzers that I have people hold in their hands when we're doing the processing, I'll see people's eyes moving. When I'm doing that, they're like, oh, my eyes are moving, that's weird. And you'll see the effective change in the body. And you'll see it, people will cry. People who never cry will cry. It's a standardization of protocols that you go through, and it's combined with talk therapy. So it helps people heal from symptoms and emotional distress known as traumas. We've talked all about that all day. Basically, what we found is that people will move on self-report. They'll move through difficult situations much faster than talk therapy. So it's not that it's more effective, it's just faster, usually. And it depends on the person, but in most cases, it's faster. As we know, life is experienced through the nervous system. And so the best thing about EMDR is you are working with the person when you do the exercises and the part of therapy that is the EMDR. You're not only talking to them and they're talking to you, but you're also having them do self-reflection where they kind of are just processing for 30 seconds of silence. So you have self-reflection, you have interaction of communication, and you've added a mind-body component where either their hands are holding onto buzzers, bilaterally going back and forth, there's special tools, or their eyes are moving, all at the same time. So you've got 3 or 4 elements going on, which is engaging the rest of the body. The research is still coming through on why all of those things work together, but we do know that they do work. So you've all heard the time heals all wounds. Well, that's not true. I would say that time wounds all heals. So essentially, meaning like your feet. Okay, that's a bad joke. Okay, so basically, a lot of symptoms, the reason that they're still symptoms is they're unresolved traumas. They don't dissipate. They get stored there, and they're stored there because our body wants to stay alive. Our nervous system's job is, it was programmed, it was whatever you want to call it, from the moment of birth to keep you alive. And at that time, it's seeking food and comfort, and when you're older, it's keeping you away from danger. So you want to avoid anything that reminds you of a past danger. We've used animal examples, but let's just put it this way. I had a client who got in a car accident. A red car broadsided them. The person ran a red light. This person was going through a green light, minding their own business, very cautious and safe driver, broadsided by this red car. Well, what happened to them afterwards was they were so afraid to drive that they couldn't hardly drive. They couldn't sit in a passenger seat. They had to sit in the middle back seat if anyone drove them anywhere, and they would scrunch down like that. And if they saw a red car, they'd have a panic attack. If they saw a red car in the parking lot at the grocery store, they'd have a panic attack. If they saw a red car on television, they'd have a panic attack. So I worked with this person through their auto insurance. Thanks to Michigan's old no-fault law, we had a lot of money in there. So they were able to get free treatment because they were hit by this car. And I saw them for only 15 EMDR sessions. So we had 2 or 3 in intake and a few kind of get-to-know-you sessions. 15 sessions of EMDR. They were driving to their job. They were actually driving to their job after 10 sessions, but they would only drive to and from their job. And after that, 5 more sessions, they were able to drive other places. Now, they still had some fears of red cars. They did not like the red cars, but it wasn't giving them the panic attack. They still had fears of driving on certain roads in Grand Rapids that reminded them of the place where they got hit. But they were able to drive, and I heard from them recently, and they're like, I'm driving fine. Once in a while I'll get a little irritated, a little bit anxious, but I'm just using some of the skills. So then after the EMDR, I did some skills training on them for stress reduction, using some mindfulness stuff. So that was only 15 sessions. That was pretty crazy that it happened that fast. Not everyone happens that fast. That was called single incident trauma. In single incident trauma, if you don't have a traumatic childhood, works really quickly. Basically, we found that the body, just like the body recovers from physical trauma, the mind can recover from psychological trauma. And what we've seen, I think I already gave this metaphor already, but if you accidentally cut your foot, like the blood is coming out, your body wants to heal that. Your mind wants to be able to resolve these incidents, but a lot of incidents are unresolved, especially if they're from relationships. You have to resolve the incident. The other people, oftentimes in a bad relationship situation, will not allow you to resolve the relationship the way you want to resolve it. Like, you've heard people say, I just need closure. What does that mean, right? That means you want to be able to have a conversation with your relationship style and the way you were brought up and with your values, and be able to have an amiable divorce, breakup, whatever, friendship ending. But normally, because we all have different styles of attachment, and we have different value systems and different cultural upbringings, even within our small community here, when a breakup of friendship breaks up, one person's value system says, cut them off, they're toxic, and the other one says, wait, we need to talk it all through, and then we'll know what to do next time. And so it's like these two people are unresolved, right? Trauma is like that. Trauma sticks around, and the only person that can resolve it is within yourself, and that's why EMDR therapy is important. We want to be able to relieve those symptoms, and that's a really cool thing about EMDR is that the symptom relief is rapid symptom relief. Trauma comes back as a reaction, not a memory. So I know that sounds weird because I'm talking about memories coming back, flashbacks coming back, but what happens really is that the trauma is coming back and your body and your mind are reacting to it, right? And so when people have these intrusive thoughts from past memories, which is one of the symptoms, I've even heard people wince, like when thoughts come in their mind, like, oh, I don't want to remember that, right? EMDR can tackle that stuff pretty rapidly. The reason EMDR works is that our body's seeking homeostasis through the adaptive information processing network. And essentially, we're trying to focus on helping the body and the mind understand why it reacted the way it did in the trauma. Because a lot of times, sometimes the trauma isn't the main thing, it's how we reacted to it that is the most shameful and terrible part of the whole thing. I've had people act out after traumas, like do bad things that they would never have done had they not been, assaulted or injured, and they went out a few weeks later and did that. Or I heard a story. There was a person who came to me whose girlfriend broke up with him in this like ridiculously terrible way, and she like kind of mistreated him. So then for like the next 2 girls that he dated. After that, he was like terrible to them on purpose. Like he told me this later. He wasn't conscious of it at the time, but he looks back and says, I was like mean to them and I broke up with them in this heinous way, and I realized I was like trying to get back at women for what this woman had done to me, right? And that's acting out. So that's shame and guilt. He had shame and guilt about the ways he did that, and actually a lot of his trauma was working through his guilt even after he had apologized to both of them. He had written them both letters or emails, whatever, and they had actually forgiven him, and he couldn't forgive himself. So that's important. EMDR helped with that. So once we can remove the obstacles to cure, then we can have healing in the mind continuing. So obviously this is going to just be a brief overview. It's a lot of work to become an EMDR therapist, but it's actually not that hard to learn. It's hard to get it into your daily practice. It's easy to learn, but it takes a little while to be able to figure out how to present it to clients. Once you get the client's buy-in and you've got the rapport, it's easy as pie. And if you have somebody that's ready for it, easy. It's hard sometimes to explain what it is to people. It's really hard. So like a lot of times I like YouTube videos and handouts. 30 controlled outcome studies have been done, and this is old research. 84 to 90% of single trauma victims no longer qualified for the diagnosis after only 3 90-minute sessions. So they might have still qualified for anxiety or depression, right? But they weren't qualifying for full-on PTSD. So there can be rapid relief for PTSD. Yeah, here's a huge one. In another study, 77% of combat veterans were free from major symptoms of PTSD in 12 sessions. And in Arizona, I worked with tons of combat veterans, and they had lots of problems, okay? But one of the things I was really able to help them with was the traumatic flashbacks of bad things that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was gone. Now, they still had alcohol, anger problems, anxiety, depression. A lot of them had really difficult households they grew up in, difficult strained relationships, but that stuff could go away pretty quick, the PTSD symptoms. I'll keep going. There's so much stuff. It's going to be in the notes. The World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric, even the U.S. Department of Defense, the VA is using it at the VA places that are functioning well. The VA is starting to use it, especially on the West Coast. We're trying to help them with the felt sense. So one of the things in EMDR is that we're working with them to reduce subjective units of distress. So that's not about what you think is going on, it's what you feel. So I'm trying to reduce them from a 10 to a 0 or a 10 to a 1 by the end of treatment. These are actual things that happen when you have PTSD. Hippocampus actually shrinks, that's in brain scans. Amygdala becomes overactive, brain scans. Decreased function of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that's involved in logic and decision making. I could keep going forever on this, but there's 8 phases and a 3-pronged approach. Let me explain. These are the phases you go through with the client. It's all going to be in your notes. I can't go through it all today. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to help stop the past events from manifesting in the present. We're trying to deal with present triggers that are activating old memories and help reduce not the fact that you will remember things, you'll still remember things, but the way it feels. So instead of the memory of your parent leaving you as a child feeling like a knife goes through your heart every time you remember it, it actually will eventually be remembered feeling like a soft blanket. Not that it's a good blanket, you still don't like it, but what I mean is that it doesn't feel the same. And that's a felt feeling in the body sense, and that's what clients all report. And then we work on future templates and working on new feelings, reactions, and behaviors. So when you go back into a triggering environment, that you're able to overcome those situations and spot them so that you can function. So I'm going to go through this really quick because I want to talk a little bit about trauma-focused CBT. So here's the crazy thing. You can read through this, but I've been researching trauma-focused CBT, and what I can understand is that the main parts of trauma-focused CBT that you need to understand are this. It's a really easy therapy to understand, and it's super easy to implement with your families and children immediately. So if you're thinking about, I want to dip my toes into some sort of trauma-specific intervention, this is the quickest and fastest one to learn. It takes the least amount of training, and it's essentially educating the parents about trauma. It's educating the children about trauma, and then it's helping the children go through different incidents and correcting their narrative about what actually happened in a talk way, and in a storybook way, and in a game way. It's almost EMDR without the bilateral stimulation, honestly. It's like the same framework, but without the mind-body element. But you bring the parent into it, there becomes an attachment element. So that's the really cool thing about TF-CBT, is you don't use the bilateral stimulation, but you get the parent to reinforce the narrative, and the parents reinforcing the narrative goes a million yards with children. Children worship their parents until they get to be a certain age when they figure out you're a regular person and then you're screwed. But before that, they do worship you. So even in foster homes, you'll talk to kids who've been removed from their parent who smoked crack in front of them and like beat somebody with a baseball bat, and they're like, oh, my parent's the nicest parent ever. They're lovely. They're friends with Martha Stewart. I know it. You know, it's kids worship their parents. So you get the parent on board with the TF-CBT, they can reinforce it at home. Very quick brain resiliency with the child. Very quick. So TF-CBT is super cool and brief like that. It brings in CBT the same way EMDR does in framing what actually happened in the trauma and helping the person orient to time and space. That's right. You have to bring in the non-offending parents. So the bad part about TF-CBT is that if you're working with children who don't have stable parents, ain't gonna work. So then you got to use EMDR, honestly. Then you really got to bring that child into EMDR. Yes?
You have a number of questions coming up.
I have questions.
I think what you just kind of answered that question, but as far as what their mental state needs to be before this can be successful.
The TF-CBT?
As far as EMDR. Specifically psychosis experience, alcohol abuse, eating disorder.
Yes.
So
Okay.
those things are all out of control.
I will answer all those questions in 1 minute. You guys can go through the slides, but essentially I think I summarized it pretty well. If they have stable parents, TF-CBT is the way to go at first. If that doesn't work, then do EMDR. If they don't have stable parents, you got to go right to EMDR with traumatized kids and talk therapy and play therapy. If they don't have a safe and secure environment, TF-CBT won't work, EMDR won't work, nothing will work. You have to get them to a safe place, obviously. So I've got some questions here. I want to thank everybody for coming. It is 5 o'clock, which means you're off the hook, but I'm going to answer these questions. Here are the questions. What is the research about the use of EMDR with somebody with psychosis? That's still coming in to Kathy. That is still coming in. We're not quite totally sure about that because it depends on what type of psychosis it is. If it's psychosis that's caused by trauma, I think it might work. If it's continuous hallucinations and delusions that is long-standing and chronic, it's probably not the best therapy for them until they're stable enough to have some type of reality. What else here? The other question was, but you can check that out on emdr.com. There's lots of research there, Kathy. If you can type, I'll type it in. Can EMDR help someone with severe anxiety and an eating disorder? Absolutely, very easy, very easy. I've treated eating disorders tons of times with EMDR. You target their triggers about the eating. You target the reasons they started the eating disorder. You target the current triggers of the eating disorder, and you do EMDR. I've done it so many times, and it's awesome because you don't have to teach them new ways of thinking. It just happens. Alcohol abuse. Real problem there. If somebody's drinking and smoking weed all the time, they're probably not going to be able to do any progress in any therapy, really. So they need to get at least somewhat clean where they're not using daily before you do any EMDR. They could obviously do talk therapy quite well, but EMDR is not going to be as effective if you're in an active addiction state. That's to Marcella. Jen, TF-CBT is the only empirically. Yeah, the adults are not the identified client. Yes, that's correct. TF-CBT is for the child and the family. The adults don't do TF-CBT. It's only empirically validated for children and adolescents. I'm sure it could help with adults, but the whole point of the program is a holistic approach. Can you use TF-CBT with one of the parents, especially when the child is from a broken home? Yes, if that parent is stable and it's a one-parent household, meaning the other parent is gone or not, or indisposed and not available, you can use it with the stable parent, absolutely. So as long as that parent is consistent in their parenting, you can easily do that, yeah. And these are some of the components. Just as we're closing, these are some of the things that it does. That TF-CBT's got in it. I wish I had more time, but I think these are just dipping your toes in the water. If you want to get into it, the trauma-focused CBT certification program is here. If you want to know about EMDR, I'd go to emdr.com. And let's see. I think that is about it, really. There's way more, but if you're looking to get certified, I really recommend EMDR for adults and children, TF-CBT for children. Somatic Experiencing is way more difficult to get certified in, but it's really worth it if you can. So yeah, that's basically our conference. We're going to be, if you follow Health for Life Grand Rapids on YouTube, or go to our website and click on our YouTube and subscribe, we are going to be posting these videos in about a month and a half, something like that. We're going to have all these videos edited and put up sometime hopefully by November, so you can re-watch it if you want.